It's a sad week, and one of the legend in music has passed away, Mr. Gary Moore, and we've Paul Devitt here to talk a little bit about Gary Moore. How's it going, Paul?
How's it going, man? How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad.
Well, yeah, without a doubt, it was like, you know what I mean? He passed away a week ago, like, you know what I mean? He was on holidays out in Spain. He passed away at the age of 60, and the whole lot, like, without a doubt, he was shortly after filling it. He was born around the age of 50. Gary Moore was hailing from Belfast. He was not only one of the greatest, if not the greatest guitar player of any description that came out of this country. He was, without a doubt, one of the greatest guitar players that ever came out of this world. Right, guitar players that are coming out now or whatever. He was one of the best that ever lived.
What made him so good?
Well, basically it was like, number one, he could turn his hand to any kind of music. He had the skills and the knowledge, whether it be technically but it wasn't just technically, it was the feeling in his playing and the depth in his playing and the soul and the emotion he could put into anything he played that made him one of the greatest ever guitar players, like, you know what I mean? He started out with the blues, like, you know what I mean? It's kind of like the first significant band he was in, and he was in the late 60s. He was only 17 years old, was, of course, the legendary Skid Row. A band formed by, of course, the legendary Bruce Shields, like an Irishman. Bruce Shields used only play the bass and kind of sing at the time. Well, he did a bit of singing, and the legendary Tin Lizzy man, and everyone knows Tin Lizzy. Phil Lynott was the singer. Phil Lynott couldn't play bass at the time, but Gary Moore, he started out basically with the blues, and when Gary Moore, around 1990, Gary Moore would, after doing a load of music, he returned to his roots playing the blues again.
Why do you think blues captured him? Was it probably something to do with growing up in Belfast?
I'm not really sure about that, like, you know what I mean? Growing up in Belfast, there was a lot of problems up there with the whole political nature of things like Protestants and Catholics. I don't know about that. I think Gary Moore used to often refer later on, when he fully developed years later as a solo artist, not only artistically successful, but commercially successful. Gary Moore used hint on things like the political things that he grew up. Obviously, he was growing up in that. I don't think really it had to do with that. I think the blues was basically one of his first significant loves, and that's the way he'd follow his guitar playing when he was a little kid, like, we'll say, practicing away. Like, I don't think he was too bothered earlier on. The blues, he was influenced by all these legendary blues musicians anyway, some of the original blues musicians, Albert Collins, Albert King, and all these fellas. And then he got in, by the time it got to the 60s, he was influenced by the likes of Eric Clapton of Cream, the heavy kind of, when blues started getting into more kind of blues heavy rock, the legendary Peter Green from late 60s Fleetwood Mac, that heavy blues rock and all that. I think it was that kind of thing. After that then, like, you know what I mean, after the demise of, we'll say, Skid Row, the band he was in, he joined Tin Lizzy for a brief spell. Like, he replaced another Belfast guitar hero, Eric Bell, and the whole lot, like, that had left Tin Lizzy in December 1973. Gary Moore joined him very early in 1974. Whatever was going on, they recorded 3 great songs together, like, you know what I mean? Gary Moore proved now that he could play the heavy rock. There was a song they came up with when Gary Moore was there, Little Darling. There was the beautiful blues of Still in Love with You, which a Lynott Moore composition, while Lynott might have taken the credit, it was definitely a Lynott Moore composition, because Moore, the original version of this song was it was so beautiful in a way, like, you know what I mean? Moore brought the blues into it so much. It was almost bluesy jazzy in a way, like, you know what I mean? And it was a kind of a duet. Lynott would sing some of it, and Gary Moore, even though he was a guitar hero, he was starting to get into the singing as well, like, you know what I mean, and the whole lot. Without a doubt, he probably sang backing vocals with Skid Row. Gary Moore wasn't anyway established as a lead singer frontman at the time, but he sang that, like, and it was most beautiful. Then he could also delve into, like Lynott, taking parts of our own heritage. Like, you know, there was a track called, they recorded 3 songs, Still in Love with You, Little Darling, Shikamoia. All 3 songs were different. Like, Shikamoia was kind of like Irish traditional melodies amalgamated into heavy rock, and yet Lynott probably wrote the lyrics and the whole lot. It was a song about racism on his behalf because he was black, like, you know what I mean. The liaison didn't last that long. I think one of the reasons was Lynott wanted to take Tin Lizzy to the next level anyway, to turn him into a kind of a twin guitar, a 4-piece, a twin guitar based kind of like lead guitar solo trade-offs, harmony guitars and all that. Moore was probably in a different thing. Moore would come up, but would go off. He'd kind of briefly launch his solo career that year, later on in 1974, with an album called White Knuckles. That kind of way, you know.
And that year was, sorry, what was that year?
1974.
1974. So he went solo in 1974. Is that what you're saying?
He did. The way it was with Gary Moore is that, like, being a guitar hero, like, he could play the blues. He was a well fluent lead guitarist. Like, he replaced Eric Bell and Tin Lizzy, but technically Gary Moore was better. Moore was technically really good at that stage, but of course, with all the feeling and the soul and the depth in his playing and all that, Moore was just a bloody genius. You know what I mean?
You also would have had Rory Gallagher around that time as well, and he would have been majorly into the blues as well.
He would,
why do you think blues had such a kind of an effect on Irish musicians? There must be something more than just that they liked it. They must have kind of had
well, basically, the way it is, Jimmy, any kind of any kind of a blues, kind of a rock guitarist of any kind of way, or, you know what I mean, any kind of a rock guitarist, not just Irish musicians. Blues had a major impact on guitar players of any kind, of all nationalities, because the blues was the thing, like, you know what I mean. The black African Americans back in the significantly late 1920s, early 1930s, we had fellas like Robert Johnson, and it was kind of like the electric guitar, the 1930s, the electric guitar wasn't even invented back then. But they used to play these songs, you know what I mean, on acoustic guitars, like the Black African Americans, or like I think it came from the whole "we've got the blues, we're down the dumps," because that whole, I think that's where the name blues came from in the first place, with all them black African Americans. They were humming and hawing about being slaves over there, like, and eventually then, when some of them could become musicians, blues came from jazz music, but you're going back years ago as well, and blues was one of the most significant musical influences. Like, blues might have came from the jazz, but it was the blues that was one of the most significant, influential musical influences. And it didn't matter what it was after that. It could have been, we'll say, pop, where there might have been guitar players, any kind of music.
Yeah.
You could hear it in bands that call themselves mod, that were playing actually rock. From the 60s, bands like The Who and all that. Blues was the most major influential type of music. So the Irish artists like Gary Moore, Rory Gallagher and all that, they were no different. The blues nearly influenced everybody.